Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets again today. Specifically, Chapter 6, Gilderoy Lockhart.
Yeah.
For teachers listening in, this chapter is a treasure trove of classroom material. We're talking character studies, the dangers of fame, those consequences. Oh boy, the consequences.
And it all kicks off with a real attention grabber. Ron getting a howler from his mom. I mean, talk about a scene that'll get your students talking.
It's a classic. I can just picture those kids' faces when Mrs. Weasley's voice booms out. If you put another toe out of line, we'll bring you straight home. Always gets a laugh.
But, it's more than just a funny moment.
Oh, absolutely.
It's a perfect opportunity to dive into consequences, something that pops up again and again in Harry Potter, really. Get those students thinking. What happens because of Ron's actions? How does it affect him, his family, his friends?
You could even tie it to real life, right?
Yeah.
Making choices, thinking about what might happen.
Exactly. And don't forget Harry's reaction in all this.
Oh, good point.
He's carrying his own guilt, knowing Mr. Weasley's in hot water at work because of their little joyride. Adds a whole other layer to the scene.
It does. You could really get into empathy with that. Seeing things from different points of view.
Yeah, how's Harry feeling compared to Ron? Makes you realize actions have ripples, sometimes ones you don't expect.
This chapter is also brilliant for character comparisons. Like Professor Sprout and Lockhart. Talk about opposites.
Night and day. You've got Sprout, all calm and collected in herbology. Then Lockhart, who, well...
Let's just say his defense against the dark arts lesson isn't quite as smooth.
You could have a whole lesson on teaching styles right there. Ask your students, what makes a good teacher? Sprout's effectiveness compared to Lockhart's. Interesting approach.
It's like J.K. Rowling is giving us a masterclass in character development all through these pairings.
She's a genius, that's for sure. Look at Hermione and Ron, too. Hermione, always ready to learn, and Ron, well, distracted, let's say, especially with that broken wand.
Every teacher knows that dynamic. The eager beaver and the one who'd rather be anywhere else.
And yet, they learn from each other, don't they? That's a good conversation starter right there. How can we use each other's strengths? What can we learn from someone who's different from us?
Then there's Harry and Lockhart. Talk about contrasting personalities.
Oh, yeah. Harry, famous as he is still humble, wants to learn, always trying to improve. Lockhart, it's all about appearances, showing off.
Big difference between actually knowing your stuff and just looking good, isn't there?
Huge. For your lesson plans, think about character webs, mapping out these personalities, how they clash, how it all drives the story forward.
All right, so let's talk about Lockhart's big moment. Or maybe I should say, his big disaster. Those Cornish pixies.
Oh, that scene. Chaos reigns supreme, but you know what? It's a goldmine for teaching.
Seriously, how so?
Well, first you've got Lockhart barging into herbology, trying to claim credit for the Whomping Willow. Hilarious. And such a perfect example of that inflated ego of his.
And Professor Sprout is not having it. Even without saying a word, you know she's annoyed.
Oh, absolutely. Body language, facial expressions, even silence can speak volumes. You could ask your students, how can you tell what Sprout's thinking without her saying a word?
And then the defense against the dark arts class.
What was he thinking? Letting those pixies loose like he could just handle them? No problem.
The result. Utter mayhem. Ink everywhere, books ripped to shreds, and poor Neville dangling from the chandelier.
Frightening a little bit, but also, you've got to admit, pretty funny.
It is, especially when you see how Lockhart handles it. Hiding under his desk, leaving those poor kids to deal with the mess.
Talk about a teaching moment. Ask your students, what's real courage? Is it bragging about what you've done, or is it stepping up when things get tough?
It really gets them thinking about leadership, doesn't it? Taking responsibility for your actions, even when it's hard. Yeah. But even amidst all that chaos, there are these smaller moments just waiting to be explored in the classroom.
Like Harry and Colin Creevey, right.
Yeah. Colin's totally starstruck, wants Harry's autograph, believes all those stories about him.
It's hero worship, plain and simple. But it shows how fame looks different depending on who's looking.
And then you've got Draco Malfoy.
Oh, yeah, using Harry's fame to taunt him. Remember that line? I don't want a foul scar right across my head, thanks. I don't think getting your head cut open makes you that special, myself.
Ouch.
Malfoy's jealousy is just dripping from that sentence. It's the opposite of Colin's admiration. Fame's a funny thing, isn't it? Can bring out the good and the bad in people.
And then there's Lockhart, using the whole thing for a photo op.
Of course he is. It all comes back to appearances for him. But you know who really stands out in this scene?
Who?
Hermione.
Oh, Hermione.
Even Eshe fell for Lockhart's charm at first. After all, she'd read all his books, just like Colin.
Yeah, haven't we all been fooled by a shiny surface at some point?
Exactly. But here's the thing. Hermione starts seeing through Lockhart's act in this chapter. She's the one who handles the pixies, with a simple freezing charm, while Lockhart's cowering.
That's such a small detail, but it's important. Hermione's practical, she's smart, she takes action when she needs to, not just following the famous wizard blindly.
You could even say it's the start of her questioning authority. And that's a valuable lesson for any student. Don't just accept what you're told, look for the evidence, think for yourself.
This chapter is just packed with teaching potential. We've got responsibility, courage, the difference between what's real and what's fake.
And that's just the first half. But let's not overwhelm our listeners.
Good idea. We'll take a breather, then dive back in with even more insights and tips for using Chapter 6 in the classroom. Stay tuned.
Welcome back. We were talking about Hermione, remember? Starting to see Lockhart for what he really is.
That's a great lesson for students, right?
Yeah.
Even someone you admire can turn out to be
Yeah.
not quite what you expected.
And it all comes back to that idea of appearance versus reality, something this chapter's really hammering home. Lockhart's all about that surface charm, but underneath, nothing much there. You could even take this into social emotional learning territory.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Have your students think about how often WE do that, Judge someone based on first impressions or how things look on social media. Lockhart's almost a caricature of that, building his whole career on stories, not actual skills.
Ooh, that's a good one. It's like a cautionary tale, isn't it? And it's not just for kids either. But back to the chapter. That contrast between Lockhart and Professor Sprout is just priceless.
Those two talk about different teaching styles. Sprout's all about safety, respect for the magical plants, practical knowledge. She doesn't need to brag, you just see how competent she is.
Then you've got Lockhart throwing those pixies around like danger is a good teaching tool. Newsflash. It's not.
What a disaster waiting to happen. And this is where you get your students analyzing, right? Why is Sprout's lesson with the mandrakes, which are deadly, mind you, actually safer than Lockhart's pixie chaos?
That's a great question to ask. Makes them think about planning, assessing risk, actually knowing your stuff, things we all need to remember, even as adults.
And don't forget, the students in all this, they're not just background-wise.
You've got Neville, terrified of practically everything, becoming the pixie's personal toy. Then there's Justin Finch-Fletchley, eager to please, even when he gets things wrong.
It's like looking into your own classroom, isn't it? Every teacher's seen those types. You can use this to talk about different learning styles, how some kids thrive on being called on while others freeze up.
And of course, we can't forget Ron. Poor Ron.
Yeah, he's having a rough time, isn't he? Still dealing with that howler, his wand's broken, everything's going wrong. Such a contrast to Hermione's confidence in this chapter.
It's important to get students thinking about why he's reacting the way he is.
Exactly. It's more than just being a teenager, right?
Right.
He feels overshadowed by Harry, his tools are literally failing him, and he's in trouble with his family. Then Lockhart comes in with all his supposed achievements, just rubbing salt in the wound.
Talk about a recipe for feeling inadequate.
Right. It's a great lesson in empathy. Sometimes those outbursts, the disruptive behavior, it's coming from a place of insecurity.
So what can teachers do with that insight? I mean, practically speaking.
Turn it into a discussion about hidden struggles. Not every kid has a supportive home life. Some have learning difficulties they're ashamed of. Ron shows how that can manifest.
It's a good reminder, I think, that there's always more to the story than what we see on the surface. Speaking of stories.
Even in a chapter that's funny on the surface, Rowling's planting seeds for the darker stuff coming later. I mean, if Lockhart's our supposed defense against dark magic...
We're in trouble. It's like she's giving us a little wink, raising the stakes.
Exactly. And you can do the same thing with your students. Get them thinking. Knowing what we know now about Lockhart, how prepared is Hogwarts for a real threat?
Ooh. That's a chilling thought. And it sets up all the tension that builds as the series goes on, doesn't it?
It does. And it circles back to those big ideas we keep talking about. Don't just go by appearances, question authority, even the charming ones. And real courage isn't about boasting. It's about showing up when things get tough.
Wow, this chapter packs a punch. We've got consequences, character comparisons, teaching styles, fame, even a bit of foreshadowing.
And we haven't even touched on all the little details, like the symbolism of the broken wand or how Lockhart's language shows he's a master manipulator. There's always more to uncover.
Always. But before we get too carried away,
let's pause here for a moment. We'll come back with some final thoughts and those practical strategies you can use when you're planning your lessons.
We're back and ready to give you those last few nuggets of wisdom for making Chapter 6 shine in your classroom.
Let's start with that howler, shall we? Funny, sure, but there's so much to unpack about consequences.
It goes way beyond Ron getting an earful from his mom, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Get those students mapping out the ripple effects. Ron's embarrassment is just the beginning. Then you've got Harry feeling guilty about Mr. Weasley's job being on the line.
And what about the family? Even if we don't see Mrs. Weasley worrying directly, you know it's impacting them.
Exactly. It's not just about one person's actions. You can connect this to real-world choices, how spreading gossip hurts people or not doing your part in a group project.
Suddenly, consequences aren't this vague idea anymore. They're real.
And while we're on the topic of consequences, don't forget that whomping willow looming in the background. It's not just scenery.
Oh, right. That damaged tree is a constant reminder of what Harry and Ron did.
It's like its own character almost, showing the lasting impact of their actions. You could even have your students write from the whomping willow's perspective. Angry, hurt, maybe even forgiving as time goes on.
Now, that's a creative writing prompt I'd love to see. And speaking of visuals, this chapter's full of them. Lockhart's flashy robes compared to Sprout's practical outfit.
It's like their clothes are foreshadowing their teaching styles. Lockhart's all show, while Sprout's all about substance. You could have students design their own professor outfits based on what subject they'd teach. Really get them thinking about symbolism.
Love it. And let's not forget the dialogue. You can analyze that for days. Lockhart's constantly bragging, while Hermione's getting more and more skeptical with her questions.
She's like the reader's voice, starting to see through the act. This is where you can teach about subtext, what's being said versus what's actually meant.
Get those kids comparing Lockhart's stories with how things actually turn out.
Yeah.
He's a walking lesson in media literacy. Don't believe everything you hear.
Right. So for teachers planning their lessons, it's about digging deeper, right?
Going beyond just the plot summary.
Exactly. The Kixies are entertaining, sure, but the real learning comes from asking WHY it all went wrong. Lockhart's arrogance, his disrespect for the creatures, for his students.
And all the consequences that follow. Neville gets hurt, the class is disrupted, even Lockhart loses credibility, though he's too clueless to realize it.
It's all connected. Encourage your students to look for those cause and effect chains. It'll make them better readers, better thinkers, even better writers when they apply it to their own stories.
So any last words of wisdom before we send our listeners back to the world of lesson planning?
Remember, Chapter 6 might seem light and fluffy, but it's setting the stage for bigger, darker things. Have fun with the humor, but don't be afraid to dig into those deeper layers.
Because even in a magical world, choices have consequences, appearances can fool you, and real courage. Well, it's not about bragging. It's about showing up when it matters.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Now go forth and create some amazing lessons inspired by Chapter 6. Happy teaching.
Thanks for joining us for another deep dive, and we'll catch you next time.